Hello, I'm Les Burnett, Head of Effectiveness at Adam and Eve DDB, and I'd like to talk about a new way to track brands and advertising. Now, historically, marketers have tended to use survey data to do their tracking, data that's based on questionnaires. But I've always been somewhat sceptical about that kind of data. In the words of David Ogilvy, the trouble with research is that people don't always do what they say, don't say what they think, and don't think how they feel. And over the last 30 years or so, I've found that the relationship between tracking metrics and actual purchase behaviour is often surprisingly weak. So for the last few years, I've been looking at new ways to track brands, based not on what people say, but on what they do, and specifically based on what they do online. And that's where Google comes in. Google is clearly a powerful tool for marketers. It's also an important tool for research, a rich source of data on what people are going to do, what they think, how they feel, and what they're going to buy. And in fact, Google like to talk about themselves as the world's biggest database of human intentions. Now, I've been experimenting with one particular metric based on Google search data, which I call share of searches. When I talk about share of searches, I'm not talking about share of paid search advertising. I'm talking about share of organic Google search queries. Here's what the metric looks like. In order to calculate share of searches for your brand, first of all, you need to get data on search volumes over time. Now you can get that data from Google Trends. That data is free. It goes all the way back to 2004 in most cases. And you can get it on a high frequency basis. You can get it weekly, for example, if you like. So gather up the search data for your brand and then do the same for all the other brands in your category, the brands that you compete with. Aggregate the search data together to produce the total volume of branded searches in your category and divide your searches by the searches for all the brands in the category. That's your share of Google search queries. We believe that this metric is a useful measure for tracking the interest, the relative level of interest in your brand compared to other brands in your category. It's somewhere between a measure of brand salience and brand consideration. That's how we believe it works. We have looked in detail at 3 product categories, and we've done an in-depth analysis of the relationship between searches, sales, and advertising in these categories. And we found very clear and very similar results in all 3 categories. The first category we looked at was automotive, new car buying behavior. Secondly, we looked at energy, gas and electricity, a commodity market, very different from automotive, very much more short term. And then finally, we looked at mobile phone handsets. So useful to get something in between these 2 categories. Now, in each category, we found very similar results. So we looked at all brands in all 3 categories, and we looked at the relationship between this share of search metric that I described and market share. And what we found was something like this in each case. This is the data for automotive. Each point represents one brand over a 10-year period. And on the x-axis, we have share of searches. On the y-axis, we have market share. And you can see very clearly there's an overall relationship between share of search and share of market. The 2 correlate very closely. Now, this is the aggregate data, but we also had monthly data on each of these brands over the whole 10-year period. So a huge number of data points. And we were able to then interrogate that relationship between market share and share of search in great detail for all the brands in the category. So we found a very, very clear relationship between share of market and share of search, but that's not enough. For one thing, a brand may have high share of search because it has high share of market. Big brands are likely to have more users And they may be searching, for example, for things like where to get their car repaired, how to open the bonnet, where to get it serviced, and so on. So as well as measuring the relationship, the correlation between share of market and share of search, we needed to also investigate the causality. The good news is that we found that in each of the three categories, share of searches is a leading indicator for market share. When share of searches goes up, market share tends to go up in the months and years that follow. When the share of searches goes down, share of market tends to go down in the months and quarters and years that follow. It's a leading indicator. Here's an example from the mobile handsets category. Here you can see the blue line shows share of searches for one brand in particular over a period of years, and the red line shows the brand's share of market over the same period. You can see that they're closely correlated. What is not quite so easy to see from this chart, but you can see it if you drill down and look very closely, is that the blue line leads the red line by about 6 months. So this brand in particular, if it had access to the share of search data at the time, could have used it to predict what was going to happen to its market share. In the early part of the data, share of searches was rising and share of market began to rise following share of searches. Then in the middle of the chart, what you can see is that suddenly share of searches begins to slump. Share of market continues to rise for a little while, but then share of market slumps as well, about 6 months later. If the brand, in this case LG, had had access to the share of search data at the time, it would have had a 6-month warning that share of market was about to turn round. Now that's an incredibly useful metric in situations like this. Now in fact, the causality is slightly more complicated than that. In fact, what we find is that there's a dual relationship between share of searches and share of market. Share of searches is a leading indicator for share of market, but also there is an effect of share of market on share of searches. So in fact, actually, the metric that you need to look at to really understand what's going to happen is in fact the gap between share of searches and share of market, which we call ESOS, extra share of search. Very similar to the ESOV metric that we use in share of voice analysis. Now, the idea that you can use searches to predict buying behavior is not new. It's been used by many marketers, particularly in the world of digital activation, for quite a long time. But I think what is new is this understanding that share of searches can be a long-term predictor of long-term trends in market share, because the lead times are surprisingly long. Digital marketers are used to using search data to predict what someone's going to do in the next few minutes or the next day or so. They rarely look at timescales longer than a week. What we find is that share of search can predict market share sometimes up to a year ahead. This chart shows how changes in share of search precede changes in market share. In the case of automotive, about 9 to 12 months ahead. Each dot on the chart represents one of the deciles of the market. So the bottom left-hand dot represents the 10% of the market with the biggest drops in share of search. The dot at the top right is the top 10%. So the data's been grouped into deciles. And that's a good way of seeing the patterns in very messy data like this. But what we find is in each of the three categories, there is a correlation between changes in share of search and changes in market share, and that it precedes it by quite a long way. In energy, about 0 to 3 months, in phones up to 6 months, and in cars up to 12 months. So in the car market, one can actually get a handle on market share movements, predict to some extent market share movements up to 12 months ahead. To test that, we ran tests actually for some years in the car market, looking at using share of search to predict market share quarters and months and years ahead tends to work best at the kind of quarterly annual level. This chart shows how the forecasts worked for one particular brand, Volkswagen. The red line shows the actual market share data, and the dotted blue line here at the end, the last 4 data points, shows our year ahead predictions for market share. As you can see, you have to look quite closely at the chart to see the difference between the forecasts and the actual market share data. The forecasts are incredibly close to what actually happened. That's not an easy thing to do with data that moves up and down like this. I mean, forecasting a steady trend is easy. Forecasting turning points like we've done here is not easy. We also compared the forecasts that come out of the share of search model against other forecasting methods. Simple methods like year-on-year changes, steady annual growth. We used about 4 or 5 different forecasting methods to try and beat the share of search forecasts. And share of search won every time, not just on an annual basis, but on a quarterly basis. This was the most powerful forecasting tool that we could come up with for forecasting quarterly market share movements for this brand. That's the best and the toughest way to evaluate forecasting accuracy, is to forecast whether you can actually beat rival forecasting methods. And it works. It works most of the time. It doesn't work all of the time. Shortly after this chart was completed, Volkswagen then ran into trouble with the emissions scandal. And that did something very strange to the search behavior. Searches for Volkswagen went through the roof because people wanted to find out about what was happening with the position on emissions, and also the various things that Volkswagen were going to do about it, the deals that they offered, and so forth. So share of searches went up, but actual share of market fell. And this does reveal a potential problem with share of search data, in that it doesn't tell you why people are searching. It just tells you that people are interested in the brand, and it doesn't tell you whether that interest is positive or negative. We saw something similar in energy at one point when bad news about rising prices caused searches for some brands to go through the roof briefly, but it was to do with bad PR. So this does point out a kind of limitation of search behavior, and it also points out a future direction for this research. And I'm working with a company right now which is actually looking at using social media data to, if you like, get a kind of sentiment analysis to understand whether searches are positive or negative. Maybe that will be a way forward. So this is not a silver bullet. It will not forecast with perfect accuracy what's going to happen to your brand, but it is useful, and the data needs to be interpreted with care. But this is true of all market research data. It's not a perfect predictor for another reason, which is that the way in which interest in a brand converts to actual sales is modulated by other factors to do with, if you like, moving through the brand funnel, as people say, stuff to do with conversion, particularly price. Here's some data that shows how that works. If you look at the conversion from share of search to share of market, simply the ratio of one to another, that ratio is a kind of conversion metric, and you can see how that relates to, for example, relative price. This is data for the car market. On the y-axis here we have the conversion ratio, the ratio of share of search to share of market. And on the x-axis we have relative price, the price of the brand relative to the market average. And you can see again there's a very clear relationship between conversion and relative price. Brands like Hyundai and Skoda at the top left have very good conversion from search to sales. Brands like Jaguar and Mercedes at the bottom right have poorer conversion, and that's to do with price. Relatively few people start out looking for a Hyundai, but those that do are highly likely to convert because it's very good value, very, very cheap. A lot of people start out looking for Jaguar or BMW or Mercedes, but then they find that they can't afford them, so conversion is poor. So this way of looking at the search data gives you a measure of the efficiency of conversion, and it also tells you something about price sensitivity. Effectively, this chart is a chart of the demand curve. It shows how demand responds to price in the car market. And that gives manufacturers and brand owners a way of thinking about how to keep demand healthy, keep sales and market share healthy if they see problems with demand at the top of the funnel, because it tells you how to adjust your price. It also tells you something else about the efficiency of the conversion process. Look, for example, at Mercedes. This is a brand that has high conversion for its price level. They're obviously doing something else right in the conversion process. That might be to do with the efficiency of, say, the buying process, the slickness of the website, or it might be something to do with actual product quality. Hyundai is another brand which sits above the demand curve. It has good conversion for its price level. It's clearly doing something right in that way in which it converts interest into sales. Whereas Alfa Romeo clearly has some other kind of a problem. It has low conversion for its price level. So something else is wrong there. So this is another way that you can use search as a market research metric. It can tell you something about not just demand at the top of the funnel, share of search, but also conversion as you move through the funnel. The third way that I have used share of search as a market research tool is to tell you something about how advertising works. And to be honest, this is the bit I find most exciting and most interesting, because we find that advertising has a clear effect on share of search in each of the three categories we studied. This chart shows you a little bit of the data, again for cars. So once again, this is data grouped by deciles. So each dot represents 10% of the market. On the x-axis this time, we have changes in share of voice. Share of voice, that is share of advertising spend. And on the y-axis, we have changes in share of search. So this is now showing you how changes in advertising inputs convert into changes in salience or consideration as measured by share of searches. Demand at the top of the funnel, if you like. This turns out to be quite a nice, clear way of measuring the effects of advertising. And you can see when you group the data by deciles like this, the correlation between share of voice and share of search is really very strong. Now, what this research shows is that share of voice in particular, rather than absolute levels of ad spend, is the useful metric to look at. This is a wonderful vindication of the decades of work that have been done showing that share of voice is an important metric for brand health and growth over the long term. And the effect of share of voice on share of search is both immediate and lasting. And this is where I get quite excited, because we find that share of voice has two effects on search behavior, one short term and one long term. If we, for example, have a 1 month burst of advertising that achieves 10% share of voice in the car market, this is what happens. You see that share of searches goes up immediately in the first month by 0.3% or thereabouts. But that initial burst of interest, that initial surge in searches that in response to a blip of advertising, decays away mostly very quickly. There's a short-term effect that decays away within a month. That's represented by the orange area. But after that initial short-term effect decays away, there is a much longer lasting effect on search behavior, which is harder to see but much longer lasting. That's the area in blue. That decays away much more slowly. So it seems that in the car market, there's both a short-term effect of advertising and a long-term effect. And we find exactly the same effect in energy and exactly the same effect in mobile phones. The shapes of the curves, the size of the uplifts are almost exactly the same in each of the three categories we looked at. Now remember, this is data based not just on three categories, but on hundreds of data points within each of those categories. So it's really quite a robust way of measuring both the short and the long-term effects of advertising. This data then tells us what repeated bursts of advertising will do to a brand's share of search. If you like, what it will do to top of funnel demand. Repeated bursts have an effect that looks like this. Each burst of advertising here, we've got 5 bursts, has 10% share of voice. Each burst produces a short-term blip in market share, represented by the spikes in orange. But also what we see is that the long-term effects, represented in blue, build and accumulate over time. Now, those of you who are familiar with my other work, the work I've done with Peter Field, will have seen a version of this graph many times before. It's the famous zigzag chart that we use to represent the way that short and long-term effects build over time. And it's exactly what the search data reveals. Our hypothesis about the way short and long-term effects build over time seems to be exactly vindicated by the search data. If you have sustained advertising, then you get an effect like this. The short-term effects stabilize very quickly, but the long-term effects in blue build and stabilize over time. So eventually you reach a point where a brand with 10% steady share of voice will eventually have a steady, roughly 10% share of search and a roughly steady 10% share of market, all other factors being equal. The other thing that this chart tells us is the relative size of the contributions from short and long-term effects. And lo and behold, about 40% of the searches generated by advertising come from that short-term effect, and about 60% come from the long-term effect in each of the 3 categories we analysed. 60-40. Now, again, those of you who know the research that I've published with Peter Field through the IPA over the years, they'll recognise that 60-40 ratio. We've always argued that about 60% of the sales effect of advertising comes through long-term brand building and about 40% comes from short-term sales activation, and that brands need to have a balance, roughly 60-40, between long-term brand advertising and short-term activation. We call that the 60-40 rule, and the share of search analysis again vindicates the validity of the 60-40 rule in each of these 3 categories. Finally, the research tells us that steady advertising like this will lead to a brand reaching an equilibrium level, and that equilibrium level depends on its share of voice. This is a familiar result from share of voice analysis. Typically, we say that a brand's market share and its share of voice will typically come into equilibrium over the long term. We find a very, very similar pattern in share of search. So a brand's share of search and its share of voice will typically reach an equilibrium, with its share of search often being close to its share of voice, but it's not quite the same. What we find here, for example, is that a brand's share of searches in the energy market may reach equilibrium above or below its share of voice. So the equilibrium level for a brand is not exactly the same as its share of voice in the share of search analysis. But for any brand, there is a unique equilibrium level. And when the share of voice is below that equilibrium level, share of searches tends to fall over the next 2 years. When a brand's share of voice is above that equilibrium level, its share of search tends to rise over the next 2 years. Very similar pattern to the pattern we see in share of voice analysis, in conventional share of voice analysis, but subtly different. the equilibrium level is not a 45-degree line through the origin. It's slightly different from that. And that gives us another way of measuring brand strength. For this particular brand, this one is SSE, what you can see is if SSE sets its share of voice to 0, then share of searches will not fall all the way to 0. They'll actually fall down to about 11% and then stabilize. That level of share of searches that can be achieved without advertising is, if you like, a measure of the inherent interest that the public has in that brand, even if that brand does nothing to communicate itself. And that, I believe, is another measure of brand strength. So using share of voice modeling to measure what the level of share of searches achieved without advertising is a way of measuring, if you like, the inherent interest that people have in a brand. This shows that measure for mobile telephony, for example. What you can see here is that even without any advertising, about 30-something% of Google searches related to mobile phone handsets will be for Apple. Apple can get a 30-something% share of searches even if they do no advertising whatsoever. That means that Apple is disproportionately the strongest brand in mobile telephony, even if it doesn't do any advertising. So I believe that this measure of the base level of share of searches, is another important metric that brand owners can use to track the health of their brands over the long term, and therefore fine-tune the level of share of voice, the level of advertising spend that they need to get top of funnel demand to the right level. And then they can use share of search to measure the efficiency of conversion through the funnel. They can use that to fine-tune things like pricing and therefore get their market share to meet their targets. It's not perfect. There is an art to all this as well as a science. And there's a lot more detail that researchers need to understand in order to apply this stuff in the real world. So I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a separate webinar in about a month or so's time. But hopefully I think you can see that this technique has potential, it has predictive power, and I think this is going to be a really powerful way of tracking brands and advertising going forward. So try it yourselves. Thank you.